Good afternoon. Welcome, welcome. On behalf of good morning, good afternoon, good day. On behalf of the Pulitzer staff, it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's program. Please take a moment to silence all of your devices. Thank you. And join me in welcoming Jennie C. Jones, Evelyn C. Hankins, and Stephanie Weissberg.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here today. Can you all hear me? Well, great. My name is Stephanie Weissberg. I'm the senior curator here at the Pulitzer, and I'm so grateful to be joined today by our esteemed guests, Jennie C. Jones and Evelyn Hankins, to celebrate the closing of Jennie's two really astounding exhibitions here at the Pulitzer. And I have to say, before introducing my two guests, how much of a privilege it's been to live with Jennie's work over the past 5 months. The ways in which you've invited visitors to engage in an intimate dialogue with your paintings, drawing, and sculptures, and the ways in which you've transformed our experiences of the building and our understanding of art history has been truly profound. And you have been an incredible collaborator, and so today we're celebrating not only the close of the exhibition, but also the other labor of love that we've worked on together, which is our exhibition catalog. And so after the program, I do encourage you all, this is the book, to pick up Jennie generously signed copies, and those are available for purchase at the front desk. So without further ado, I will introduce Jennie C. Jones, who explores the intersections between the visual and acoustic with paintings, sculptures, drawings, and installations. She earned her BFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago in 1991 and her MFA from Rutgers University in 1996. She has been the subject of numerous solo shows, including at the Guggenheim, the Arts Club of Chicago, Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden, Contemporary Art Museum Houston, and most recently, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where she completed the Roof Garden Commission, titled Ensemble. Not only is her work included in museum collections across the continent, she has also been the recipient of several awards, including the Anonymous Was a Woman Award, Robert Rauschenberg Award, Joan Mitchell Foundation Grant, the William H. Johnson Prize, and the Heinz Award. So please join me in welcoming Jennie. And we're also very pleased today to be joined by Evelyn Hankins, who's an independent curator and art historian with over 25 years of museum experience. From 2008 to 2025, she served at the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden, where she was appointed head curator in 2022, and later named head curator emerita by the Smithsonian. During her tenure, she led major exhibitions, shaped a new collection strategy for the museum's 50th anniversary, and organized landmark exhibitions with artists including Adam Pendleton, Sam Gilliam, Charlene von Heil, and Jennie C. Jones in a 2013 solo exhibition titled Higher Resonance. Hankins holds a PhD in art history from Stanford University. So without further ado, I will hand it over to you, Evelyn.
Thank you.
Yes.
All right, so as long as everyone can hear me. First of all, I want to thank Stephanie and everybody here at the Pulitzer. It has been a joy to be working on this program and to have the opportunity to see Jennie's show. Just really quickly, I want to thank Stephanie and Cara and Tyler and Vaughn and Heather, Emmy Pulitzer for her extraordinary building, and Jennie for, I'm assuming, suggesting that I be in conversation with her. So anyways, Jennie and I go way back. So let's get everybody caught up on our lives together. We met in 2011, 2012. You had just had a show at the Kitchen called Absorbed Diffuse, which I had seen. I don't remember how I got in contact with you, but somehow we got in touch and we did a studio visit together. And we had this kind of magical studio visits. Studio visits don't always go so well, or they're awkward, or they're strange, but we seem to have this instant connection based on our mutual interests and I think respect for each other's kind of projects. And so by the end of it, I was like, we got to find a way to do a show. And by 2013, we opened what I think is one of the most special projects we've had at the Hirshhorn. It was a show called Directions, which is a project series, Jennie C. Jones, Higher Resonance. And it was a really beautiful exhibition. I'm just going to go through some photos here. You can see it was an architectural intervention. The Hirshhorn has these kind of amazing round galleries, thanks to Gordon Bunshaft, and Jennie did a kind of architectural intervention with, I think, is the most expensive wall the Hirshhorn has ever built. It was a beautiful curved comma-shaped wall. It had sound panel paintings. It had acoustic speaker sculptures. It had works on paper. And it was a beautiful exhibition, but it was just, I think what was so wonderful was the sound work and the way it inhabited the space. So Jennie, I'd love to have you kind of think back to that show and think about what the premises were of the show, both in terms of your work at that point, but also what it was like to work with the Hirshhorn's building.
So firstly, I have to say this is like a dream that I wanted to happen from the beginning, because these are become dear friends and two of my favorite curators who I've had a total pleasure, and it's been an honor to have all these conversations, both personally and professionally, and the grace and respect that I think we have for each other's ideas helps lift up manifesting what artists are thinking. So you're both really amazing to me. I'm gonna cry already, my God. I was like, it's over, the show's closing. And also, I've told many times the story of our first studio visit, because what Evelyn did not point out was that it was in my apartment, because I didn't have a studio. And the kitchen was a really pivotal exhibition for me at the time, because I was in an I told you so or I'll show you phase from a lot of nonprofit shows and a lot of sort of intermittent insecurities about the topics that I was addressing and their sort of lack of interest from particularly the commercial gallery universe. But our conversation that led to this was so pivotal in so many ways, because unlike working with a curator who's involved with the contemporary art scene, Evelyn's research background, her whole oeuvre is really modernism and modernist histories. So my whole sort of premise from grad school onward was, where am I in relationship to those histories? Where are women and people of color and even sonic practices? How do they fold into modernist histories, and how that was shaped in America sort of post-war, which now that's another thing to think about, how we're repositioning that narrative now and what that means and how that shift is going to affect how we look at history and how we feel inclusion and exclusion from those narratives evolve moving forward. But the Hirshhorn itself, with this round building, I mean, I basically used my entire budget just to make a wall. And then I did have my first studio to make these works, and I think it was about 300 square feet. So I do remember when we installed this, I had never been able to see the whole series out. And the Smithsonian remains like chef's kiss experience. There was like way too many humans for my introverted self, but there was like 6 people with white gloves standing, and they laid all of them out. And I'd only seen like probably 2 or 3 at a time in my studio. And I was just like, I almost feel like, I can't believe I made this, because it was so piecemeal and over time and with what means I had at the time. And there was a lot of trust and a lot of sort of also beautiful conversations and spontaneity, which I feel like we experienced installing here as well. Just the ability to be mutable and flexible and responsive to the space, and not locked into things that were discussed earlier in the process of what the exhibition would be, which is just full of grace and experimentation and all that good stuff. So anyway.
Thank you. So since then, you've had a lot of amazing shows. Guggenheim,
A decade.
Met, a decade. Well, that's a lot of amazing shows. And I would say that show was important for both of us. It was Jennie's first solo museum exhibition, and it was a relatively early, important project for me as well. So I felt like both of us learned a lot from that and figured out like what our priorities were moving forward. So I'm interested, your practice has obviously deepened, expanded, taken on a much larger scale than it did at the Hirshhorn. But there are some important through lines. There's that deep cross-disciplinary research that's really the kind of core of your work, an interest in both found materials and objects from music, and that you then use to kind of rethink about our kind of long-standing conceptualizations of painting, sculpture, and architecture, sound works that you make, often from the works of African-American composers and musicians, and a critical engagement with the space, both the physical engagement with the space, but also the institutional history, which I think is something that isn't always so obvious when you go in the shows. Jennie's works, whether it be the Met, thinking about the musical instrument collection at the Met, but the kind of lack of minimalism in the Met's collection, or thinking about the Hirshhorn and the works we surrounded you with. But I'm wondering if you could talk about briefly how your work has kind of shifted but stayed the same since the Hirshhorn show, since it was so important.
I think the Hirshhorn show had a lot of prompts that continued, and I think that opportunity also, like this and like the Met, it expands thinking and makes you sort of hungry to like figure out new ways to continue, but also to punch your elbows out and expand. So the prints that we had at the Hirshhorn were stringed prints that I made at the Lower East Side print shop, and then it's just kind of kismet that manifest as giant sculptures, or like drawings that I was making that were sort of in imaginary spaces started to manifest in architecture in a way that brought them from the page into the dialogue of what white boxes mean for sound, and also really being like, we've talked about it before, is like site responsive versus site specific, and really being present in a space, acknowledging the architecture, the history, even the physical location, the Met with all of its trappings underneath and all of the burden of history, and how to sort of be buoyant and held up by it, and rupture it a little at the same time. So the Guggenheim also made me think so much of our project because it's the only other curved museum that I know of. And so there was this familiarity with what that sort of feels like when you have a pocket, and to create like a little arc, a pocket where sound and intimacy can exist, that the work can be tactile and close and have a tenderness to it because it's being held by this curve instead of the more brutalist kind of linear space. The work is already linear enough. So then it snaps into this space in a way that was like, oh, amazing. Because let's keep those lines moving and keep this sort of fluidity between the spaces they occupy by paying homage in a more aesthetic, granular way.
Well, I will say, everyone always compares the Hirshhorn and the Guggenheim. The Hirshhorn is a much easier building to install things in because you're not on a slope, and there's a lot more flexibility with those galleries. I mean, once you kind of understand you can't beat the architect, it's a really amazing space, and artists always do extraordinary things in it. So let me go to the next slide. You've spoken about your admiration of individuals who operate out on the periphery purposely, this idea that they a kind of radical act to work on the margins and to not be marginalized, but kind of empower it. And it made me think a little bit about the kind of arc of your project and your work since we worked together, because you hadn't had a museum show yet at the until you had the Hirshhorn show, and now you were at the Smithsonian, you've been at all these major museums, the Met, the Guggenheim, you've not only had these shows, but all of these extraordinary institutions collect your work. So I'm wondering if you could reflect a little bit about what it was like to go from the periphery to the center.
I still consider myself on the periphery. I don't know how to expand on that, other than I participate with my whole heart, and then I go back and hide. And, we talked about before, a lot of the artists that are in the exhibition downstairs, or here, have this similar kind of ebb and flow in terms of being protective of their energy, of their time, so that kind of jouissance can be in the work, and to allow yourself time to recharge. And my punk rock self from the 80s is more like, you kind of get cool points when you don't show up to. Like, I always think of Adrienne Piper, who I'm just like, every once in a while I Google her and I'm like, oh yeah, she's in Copenhagen. She's just like, and yet her work and her impact is generationally like this powerhouse of conceptualism. And so there's less ability to do that because of the many platforms we're expected to occupy. But I lavish in the research, and that's what happens in that downtime, just starting to read weird books and walk in the woods.
except for when it's snowing and -4, which it is right now. You've described yourself as a conceptual painter, and I think one of the things that I've always admired about the work is that you are just increasingly fearless in the way you hold things in tension that art history has always held in opposition. Found objects, Duchamp, and painting, the most traditional of mediums, modernist art and function, because usually modern art, especially painting, doesn't do anything except for be what it is. Abstraction and social political criticism, and most recently minimalism and gestural mark making. You know, when I was looking and getting ready for this show and looking at all of your work, I was like, oh, it's so logical. Of course, this is where it all went, but that's not how art making works. So I wonder if you could talk briefly about your relationship with modernism, and mostly you're thinking about mid-century modernism, but then also if you could talk about how you approach a project or how you approach a new body of work. I mean, you talked a little bit about the research, but if you could share a little more.
Yeah, I mean, definitely mid-century onward is also because it's mirroring so much of our social political history and shifts that we tend to separate all of these different things that are happening at the same time. And I think it's come up before, like when I did my DIA talk, I referenced that like Alice Coltrane lost John and went on her own journey the same year that Agnes Martin lost Ad Reinhardt and left. And we forget that all of these characters and all of these narratives, and especially with women artists, it's all happening in the same time period. We tend to separate Black history, music history, even film history, art history into these separate things, but it's the same historic snapshot. So the more you can bring that together, the more sort of kindred spiritness can happen, like that's happening with a lot of the works on paper here, and ways that communities were happening and building, and what we can learn from that. But in terms of research, there's always something that like catches me that I then rabbit hole, and it opens up into something else. So I've always loved printmaking and paper. I used to, when tech was waving, I would say, paper doesn't crash, you know? You're not gonna get the spinning wheel, it's paper. And like printmakers and bookmakers, and it's just such a lovely medium that's immediate, it's cheap, it's easy. I know that I've told students a million times, like when I didn't have a studio, you can sit at a table and make 100 drawings, and 100 drawings can fill a very large space. So I still do think in that way, very turning of the page. Even seriality becomes important. I'm not answering your question.
That's okay.
But we knew that would happen. At least I'm not telling any of our stories,
No,
because that could happen too.
Thank you. And also you're being the politician. I'm going to answer the question I want to answer, not the one that you asked. Anyway, speaking of questions like that, one of the things, your work engages the body, and I think that's very clear here at the Pulitzer, whether it be the human scale of the works, even when there are multiple panels. The panels always remain human scaled, and so there's this kind of invitation and reminder that it's about you and the paintings. But then it's also about how when you inhabit the space, and it makes you think about the architecture, and then the way the sound moves through the space, and how the paintings are influencing how that sound moves the space. So as I look at your work, you know, on one hand it's transcendent, and on the other hand it kind of forces you to get back in your body, and it's that kind of back and forth that I always find so interesting. So, but at the same time, you've been very forthright about the way that you refuse a lot of things about your work, and your kind of refusal to put your own body and your own subjectivity in that. And this idea that, like, I think the phrase, I wrote this down, you talked about kind of Black figurative artists as being kind of reselling the Black body in the commercial art world. And I'm wondering if you could talk about both that refusal, but the kind of possibilities that opacity open up. Like there's possibility, not just refusal.
Yeah, I mean, I do feel the commodification is a big elephant in the room always, and having signifiers in the work and what collectors and institutions demand in terms of having that signifier in order to sort of qualify their collections as containing certain ideologies. But I think that short sells a lot of the rich interior life, the tenacity, the spirit, the energy, the consistency. So for example, when I made the score for Sustained Blackness, which was 100 pages, it really was about that. It's like, this is a continuum. And so if we keep plucking out portraits of ourselves, particularly in a time where there's just endless selfies. I mean, I've made, I thought I'd make jokes about Greek mythology, but it just feels like this Narcissus, where it's like, if there's so many selfies, why is there such a there is a romance for portrait painting. I'll just say that, but it's a push-pull forever. You both know this, figurative abstraction. It's like the ebb and flow that happens of what's in trend. But the people that are involved in that, it's a different subjugation. And I find a freedom in rejecting that. And there's a huge amount of information, artists, conceptual themes, heroes of mine that are all in this exhibition that hold me up in that decision. But I would say it was definitely a hard path. It was harder to find that core and trust myself with these decisions. Because like you said, and at the end of the day, it is also about the body. These pieces hold space in a way that I hope has a gravity. And, I'm also sort of dictating the movement of people and how they are curious and looking at sides and edges. And so there's this other kind of dance, which having that Trisha Brown image of the duets sort of embodied that whole other way of interacting with people.
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting, we talk about, I can't believe that we're still having this conversation that African-American artists are expected to make figurative works. I mean, that's been going on for how many decades now? And, I remember when, Mel Edwards was fighting that in the 1960s, and here we are.
And these are my teachers at Rutgers, and Emma Amos, and
and then we're still having these conversations. It's astounding and not surprising in a lot of ways. I want to talk a little bit, let's see if I get this, the next one, a little bit about process, and that's right, I'm just going to talk about this first, process and media. When we worked together, I never saw any drawings or collages, except for what we saw in that studio visit, and they were never part of the conversation about what would be in the Hirshhorn show. So to my mind, these float a little bit differently. So I wonder if you could talk about how they play into your practice. So we have collages here from the show, and then this kind of beautiful gestural work.
Well, the drawings really went from, I was saying, just the utility of working with paper and not having lots of jobs and not having studio space. And I think I got a residency in Paris. I lost my job and put everything in storage. That was fun. And I had time to sort of use drawing as an imaginary space for installation. And then I sort of stopped the drawings as this place of thinking about how would I install speakers. It was very hardware driven at the time, pre-wireless. So then it was about things being tethered. And the line has evolved over all of this time that we've known each other, from literally drawings of cables connecting, using this kind of metaphor of people as conduits and who has a voice and who doesn't, and how that interacts in a space. But once it sort of evolves into scores and making graphic scores, the line of media turns into the line of staff lines. And then that kind of, when I was teaching at Skowhegan in 2014, the score for Sustained Blackness began there. And it was really about painting again. And so the line becomes the hand and gesture bringing me back to painting, which I really had sort of not abandoned, because you can never abandon it. It's since undergrad.
Right, and I think just to mention, this is actually just a part of it, because there's 100
yeah,
works.
It's 10 sets of 10.
And can I ask, does the Whitney own all of them, or is it one of the 10 sets?
That's funny. No, I'm sorry.
Museums, okay. Speaking of works on paper, let's talk about those scores. That's where we're headed anyways. You make these beautiful graphic scores. They function in different ways, but they've increasingly are being performed, and as part of the Met Rooftop Project Ensemble, they closed that show with the International Contemporary Ensemble, led by George Lewis, performing your scores in October. What was it like to have George Lewis, who I know is who you and I have been talking about since 2013, and he's gone from being a hero to being a peer or a colleague.
Yeah.
What was it like to have your work
Well,
performed?
George left me in the cold there. He was just like, I'm not the composer, you're the composer. And so he came to, we had 2 days of workshops, and he came in for 20 minutes and would drop these epic statements or some memory about something that he was thinking of in an opera, or also something that happened in 1975 in response to how things were unfolding. But the exciting thing for me, which I think also blossomed because of the development of looking at a lot of text pieces here, poetry, graphic scores, and revisiting Ben Patterson, looking at these things again, reminded me that yes, notation can be instructions. There's that core kind of way of thinking, and I don't want to specifically say it's the 70s, but so I studied performance notes. So I worked with 8 musicians. We did a 2-day workshop. I did learn, which was very ironic, that I was kind of like, strings are really aggressive. I was like, all these stringed instruments, and I was like, can you guys just like take it down a notch? But it was an incredible experience, playing with others, really relinquishing and accepting that work like this is subjective, and that musicians are bringing their own skill set and their own interpretation. So trying to give like some parameters and feeling and tone that I was looking for, but then letting go. And when you work alone and you're in control of all your shit on your own, and then you have 8 people, and I'm like, I did not think that was gonna sound that way. But you are a maestro on the trombone, so you do you. And a lot of really incredible things happened. So I feel like I have a lot to think about from this exhibition and from that experience, and I'm glad I have a little mental space to sort of process all of this beautiful gifts that I've been able to receive.
Well, I'm not going to ask you what you are doing next, so we'll save you that. Let's talk about the 2 kind of extraordinary shows that are here. A Line When Broken Begins Anew, and then Other Octaves. It's a beautiful pairing of Jennie's work. And as I said, we have all learned that you're a curator. And if you want to give up the artist thing, good curator. So they're just beautiful exhibitions, and they're thoughtful, and like everything is so precise yet so not emotional, but they're real. They're not just, it's not like minimalism on the wall and like as a way to kind of be prescriptive. It's so evocative and elusive at the same time that it's precise. Let's talk about working, and I realized I skipped over. Let's talk about what it was to work with this building. It's the second time you've worked with an Ando building because you did this project at the Clark. Could you talk about what elements you were most interested in responding to, and what the challenges were with this building? I mean, it's an extraordinary building, but...
I really don't think there were challenges. Challenges are in buildings that are horribly designed, that don't feel like artists belong there. And I think that just the fact, like the first institution that I experienced that had such an ever-changing beauty and poetry of natural light was at the Manil. And this is the same way. The show changes throughout the day, and the building just keeps you engaged. It's refreshed, anew, depending on the weather and the season. And I think that just that in itself made my shoulders drop a little. Like, oh, yes. And also, hello, lines. It's just, everything is so precise and elegant for like a control freak that believes in line and space and light and air. So maybe it was challenging to figure out the exact volume of the sound so that it wouldn't be carried all the way to the front, and that it would function more like a siren song, that you might already be engaged when you sort of hear something that pulls you in. But sound is always challenging no matter what the architectural space is.
Well, one thing that happened yesterday when we were here, Stephanie and Jennie and I were upstairs, up by there's a place to sit up there. I had never really noticed these grates, and it wasn't until we sat up there and we were like looking over and chatting that I was like, oh, there are these grates. And so it was like the way your show made me rethink the building. Like you think you know a building, or you think you understand architecture, and then kind of the most subtlest things that you put in the space make you go, oh, it made me rethink kind of both the volume and the kind of linearity of the space. Before I pass this over to Stephanie, I do want to ask a quick thing. Since we worked together, 2 things have entered your work. Gesture, which was never never on the table when we were working together,
Yes.
but also a shift from using acoustic panels to architectural felt. And I'm wondering if you could just talk about this kind of willingness to transcend that reticence to engage gesture, and also what the architectural felt does. It's especially beautiful up in the gallery with the sound work.
Yeah, so I started working with acoustic panels, and the kitchen exhibition was 2011, and the first time I used the felt was in the Guggenheim, and it just added another layer that was more pliable that I can cut myself. I mean, a lot of the acoustic panels are notoriously they're not fun to work with. It's like fiberglass. So I work with a women-owned business to have those cut. But the felt gives another layer, another dimension. And gesture is underneath a lot of the paintings that we had. It's almost like an exorcism of freedom and gesture, and then I would hone it and cover it and cover it and cover it with layers. And so slowly, the older I get, the more I'm like, well, let's think about like the pentimenti. Let's think about what underpainting is. When there's always a moment with the ones that are that dense, where I've sort of made a painting that no one else will see. So it's also like a little bit of a self-indulgent thing, or what's underneath a panel might be something more wild that doesn't get shared. So there's also this sort of intimacy and selfishness, because I mean, we give so much there's so much vulnerability, and I think people forget, even friends I know that are like really rock stars are like still have this vulnerability and this insecurity that maybe they don't perform it. So there's something about holding back. And I used to tell students that all the time, like don't give it all away. Like you need that. You need to keep that for you, so that, it can grow and evolve over time. And the materials grow and evolve over time, and your hand will change. So, yeah, I'm just feeling like a proper old lady now.
I will say, speaking of indulgent, we were looking at the show yesterday, and we were sitting in front of the diptych of paper upstairs on the left, and there are these wonderful little strips of paper. And when I first saw the show on my own, I couldn't tell that it was an acrylic wash. I thought it was like a print of an acrylic wash. And then you and I were talking about how you indulged your desire to be an abstract expressionist with these acrylic washes, but then you go in and you make little squares and rectangles to kind of rein it back in. And I thought that was kind of a beautiful metaphor to think about how you work. So I am going to, because I'm a curator, but I did not work on this show. Oops, what happened? There we go. I'm having problems. I would love to have you and Stephanie talk about Other Octaves. I know, it's fabulous. Yeah. Other Octaves. I did say, they are beautiful shows. From what I had seen online, I didn't realize it was 3 full galleries, and each one is different and sets its own tone, but there's this beautiful transition from each one, like the Agnes Martin painting sets kind of brings you into the gallery with the Carmen Herrera, and I've probably said 10 times, you should not be able to put that much green in a gallery, because then it becomes a thing, and you don't want to do that thing, but you pulled it off, and I remain just so amazed at your kind of brilliance in that way. So I would love to have the two of you talk about Other Octaves.
Yeah, and one follow-up I have for you actually about A Line When Broken Begins Again, before we get into Other Octaves, is just, and this may not be a question that you love, but, when Evelyn asked about challenges working in the space, I think the building itself, it wasn't so much of a challenge in our conversations, but there was an initial reaction, I think, to what is currently blocked actually by the screen, but the Ellsworth Kelly, the permanent wall sculpture, Blue Black by Ellsworth Kelly, which is kind of a hallmark of the space. And it was amazing from my perspective to see the way in which, every artist that exhibits in the upper level galleries at the Pulitzer contends with the Kelly, and your reaction to it was very specific and nuanced and insightful. So I wonder if you'd just say 2 sentences quickly about what what your initial reaction was like, even
Well,
yeah.
we have the initial reaction was that we did a lot of like 8th grade experiments together by cutting up paper and standing far away. And I did the cliched like cartoon thing where I put my thumb up and closed my eyes and wanted to see what this building was without that. And it was almost more like we talked about briefly yesterday, it was almost more a response to the color than it's not like necessarily a response to Kelly as much as how to be in a space with that color being so dominant. But then also there's these other layers of my experience with Kelly that felt like, oh, here we go again, man. And yeah, so.
Thank you. I have, thought a lot about you as a curator. This is your first venture into curating, but at the same time, your artwork is in many ways draws from the same principles that curators do, in that it's deeply researched. You're very invested in the histories of artists that have come before you, and you are somebody who cares deeply about acknowledging histories and as you acknowledged earlier, about thinking in an interdisciplinary way. And I think that probably went a long way towards your immediate success as a curator. But I'm wondering if you can just reflect on, in beginning this process, what were the first kind of works, ideas, principles that came to mind to you as kind of guiding lights?
It's like the greatest hits list. It's like all the artists that I love, that I have written about, or that, like I said before, I feel gave me permission or held me up or inspired me. And I keep talking about, like, when I was teaching more, that there's this whole thing of originality that still exists, which I'm always just like, it's everything. You're like, it's not going to happen. It's just like, so I would always say, like, find your spirit animals, find your community through art history. What art history does is give you the opportunity to time travel and to find kindred spirits, and it could be a total surprise that something that happened 200 years ago is something in it is what you're thinking about or what you're doing. So I think that there's always this conversation with artists between other artists. And then I think the meta thing is that curators operate in this way that maybe it's not about my kindredness, but it might be the decision-making for curatorial studies is much more rigorous than saying, like, here's my favorite Alma Thomas painting, and I'm gonna pivot off of that, her color story, and I'm going to bring in all of these other sort of women and hard edge painters, and as a call and response almost from that favorite little gem painting with the green.
So much green. It should not work. I'm going to just say this again. It should not work.
But I have to say, one of the guards here was just like, pink and green is alpha kappa alpha, like, colors. And I was like, I know. It was just kind of like a little wink. Anyway, it's a black women's sorority thing, HBC situation.
I think another thing that's remarkable about what you've done in the curatorial venture is to really think about telling stories in space. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how the placing these works in relationship to one another felt similar or different to doing the same thing in your own practice, because upstairs it's also, it's such a unified whole, this experience that you've created between your paintings and drawing and sculpture and sound. And how do you approach installing the work, and how does it differ between your own work and other people's?
I think there's a certain sequence that lives in the studio. I take pictures sometimes in the studio because I know that once, I'm working in batches still in a humble size space, that I think it's always like a sentence. That was one of our first kind of ways of framing it. And this is such a long space that it's a long sentence. So where are the breaks? Where are the pauses? And how do you make a sequence that flows both forwards and backwards because of the ability to walk in a loop in this space? So you could come from this side and have a different experience than walking the other side. And also the sort of depth of the pieces give you a reveal as you go from side to side. So we talked a lot about the sentence, and we had, the flexibility and your guidance in knowing the space and how people flow in the space, but also just the grace of saying, like, we have ample time. We can move things around and we can leave it here for tonight and come back with fresh eyes and say, is this still working? Do we want to move something back? And that part of the process is really amazing because it's kind of what I do in the studio. And you reminded me that you had me turn a painting around on our first visit because it was like a distracted from what was happening. And I was like, yeah, absolutely. And then we ended up putting it in the hall because it was like, just take it out of the room altogether so we can see clearly what this looks like. And so that, I think just the way I move the widgets around in the studio kind of helped with installing and even with curating. I use the same parameters to curate, which is to tell a color story, to keep things overwhelmingly tight and connected, either through line or form. And even yesterday, looking at the Greats and looking at the Witten, and then looking at Agnes's tiny lines, there's just like same and yes and kind of mentality.
It's funny that you mentioned the words in a sentence, because in a piece of writing that you did on Alma Thomas, many years ago, you compared her strokes to words in a sentence. So I think the idea of the part and whole has clearly been, with you and shows up in your work in so many different ways. And I think that's actually a good transition to thinking about your writing. Something that I'm really excited about with this catalog is that we've not only had, new essays by myself and you, but also we've been able to bring together several essays that you had written in various contexts and brought them together for the first time. And I think hopefully that gives readers a sense of how strong of a writer you are and how deeply you have thought about other artists for an extended period of time. And I wonder, you once wrote, to be an artist is to write one sustaining poem over a lifetime. I'm wondering, why has your writing about other artists been important to you over the years, and how do you see it relating to your intellectual frameworks as an artist?
Well, I think specifically about Anne's work, because Anne's one of the artists who was courageous enough to publish all of her journals as standalone writings. And what happens in her books, and Day Book in particular, is just that, we're often just sitting in a room, staring at the floor, or mixing a paint and you're like, that's today. And that is a blessing. That means you are at a place where you are able to either have sacrificed something in your life in order to have that time and space. But I think there's something that else that happens when you're able to just write about what that means and what that ability means. And it is a blessing and a curse. It sounds such a cliche, but like when I was 6, I said, I'm going to be an artist. And I'm like, okay, all right, we'll see how that works. And, my lawyer brothers just now, did you pay your student loans off? And I was like, yeah, I was 53. And I finally paid my student loans off. But all to say, writing is also has been another deep place of vulnerability, because most of these things are in my sketchbook, and they have dripped into the world slowly, and this is the most I've shared that is part of the process for me. That often will lead to the research. And also I think voices like Fred, who bridge this world between poetry and criticism and theory, also open up. I think Roland Barthes was the first time I read theory that I was like, but it's poetry. And that was 1987 or something. And then that space becomes something less terrifying and less scholarly. And you can be dyslexic and spell everything wrong, and then you can help me clean it up before the book comes.
I really think it'll be a revelation for people to read your writing. It has been for me to kind of see everything in one place and to understand the depth of your thinking. So thank you again to both of you so much. We're about to open it up to question and answer, but quickly, I think we all wanted to throw out a question to someone in the audience. Our founder and board chair, Emily Pulitzer. The Pulitzer has a long history that really Emmy initiated of inviting artists to curate in the space. And it was really her vision about artists as people who could help us understand artwork and art history in a profound and new way. And in fact, Ellsworth Kelly is one of the people who has curated here. And I'm curious, Emmy, if you could speak a little bit about what it's been like for you during the process, the evolution of this show, to have Jennie curating at the Pulitzer.
Especially the work that is in response to blue-black. My initial reaction was, oh no, it shouldn't be in front of blue-black. And I'm very protective of the view of blue-black. But as I got to understand the work, it's a conversation that is absolutely extraordinary between the viewer, Jennie's work, and Kelly's work. And it's the most enriching and fascinating approach to a similar form that is sensitively responding also to the architecture. And Kelly, Ando originally had the entrance to the Cube Gallery much taller. And Kelly asked him if it could be lowered because he didn't want another tall rectangle next to his. Well, Jennie is pulling that space into this space with the red light, which when I first heard about it, I thought, how horrible. And in fact, it's absolutely magical. And the black line. So she really has pulled the experience here in this room and brought in the other in, I think, quite a magical way.
Thank you, Emmy.
All right, I'm going to faint. And a happy anniversary. This is the beginning of the 25th anniversary year. And what an incredible human being you are. What a gift.
So I think we're ready now to open it up to a couple questions from the audience.
I have a question about how much help visitors need to appreciate the work, especially what you curated. So I think this institution doesn't hang chatty discursive labels because they want us to focus on the art. But when I picked up the laminated sheets, especially in the exhibit, I found things that I could not hope to retrieve from just looking at the work itself. So I just wonder what you all think about that dilemma on the part of appreciators.
That's the ancient quandary, right? Because at the core, all artwork is subjective, and you have to relinquish that. And as much as we want to put language as a pivot from writing, as much as we want to assign language onto things that are either ephemeral or experiential or that subjective, it is what it is. I can say that my work means this, and someone can say, I didn't get that at all. But that's the beauty of it, right? So I think that didactics and wall text and explanations only can be a prompt. They can tell you, there's a quote that's, a great teacher tells you where to look, but not what to see. And I think that that applies to the way institutions, especially thoughtful ones like here, leave things open and don't hit you with so much explanation on the wall, but let you be in the space, especially with the light that I was talking about. Yeah.
I just have a comment. I don't have any questions. But this is like Paul's praise, but the conversations you've had was the most clearest and articulate description of what an artist and a teacher does. And I'm someone who's done both for a long time, so I really appreciate that. And also the way the conversation went back and forth with Q&A. So bravo.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed this. Thank you. Something when you were talking about the work you make in the first half of this talk, it was a lot about relations and how it fit in the space and things like that. And that's how I experienced the show. Like, I saw your work first in the room back there. And then I came downstairs and I was like, oh, same person, but different. And then it had made me go back upstairs and see things maybe in a different way. And so I wondered how you thought about the placements of your work up here, or what work, and the curation of the show downstairs, and how those might interact, because it's not like they're two separate shows, but they're together too.
Yeah, I think that in a lot of ways the Truitts are the bridge, right? And you also get a scale change from seeing a singular standing form, which in a score you could visualize as a volume holding sound in the drawings or not. But to see the shift from Kelly to Truitt, to see something that's so intimate, like that yellow piece, it's like huggable. It's the scale where you're just like, oh my God, also terrifying that you're going to touch it or knock it over. But I think that the theme, another kind of pivot from Kelly, was to have a lot of, to hold that space as a totem and a different kind of totem. Like, Anne talks about that. And I also think just about, like, not to sound like an earther, but when your feet are on the ground and you have like this alignment. And I think that Anne does that with color in a different, much more intimate, poetic way than Kelly holds space in this other way. So I hope that kind of was a little bit of a thread. Yeah.
Is it okay we go next door for the question?
Hey.
Thank you so much. This was beautiful. And I think this is sort of a spin-off of something I asked you before, but I'm struck today so much by these ideas of slowing down, both in your creative process, like you were talking about recharging and walking in the woods, but also in the space. And I think I'm also reflecting on culturally. I think we're losing that ability. People don't have the attention span. They can't be with themselves. There's so much distraction. So I'm just curious what you think about slowing down, if you think of it as a kind of resistance or a kind of like we have to fight to preserve that, and what is possible in that, like slowing down, looking closely, being with ourselves, being with other people.
I think it's critical now. And I think that sometimes I feel like even just airport experience, I'm just like, I feel so overwhelmed with the pace. And I know that most of us feel that way, whether we say it or not. Like introvert, extrovert, all the tags and names that we put on it. It's exhausting. We are exhausted now. And I do feel encouraged that, like, and I also kind of want to laugh, is that there's like listening rooms, and like at upstate New York, there's like a listening cafe opened, and I'm like, I can't wait to see what those children are up to, because they're like, we have vinyl, and I'm like, okay, wow, and they want to sit on the floor without their phones and listen to records, and I'm like, that is so not new. That is like, but I'm so glad that the babies are also just like, yeah, my phone is wrecking my ability to be in the world and to make eye contact and to smile and say good morning to someone. Like, it's crazy. I remember when I moved to New York, just like chatting it up with some random person on the subway was probably like sometimes an experience you wish you didn't have. But and now I just remember the first time I looked across the subway before I left and skipped upstate, and like no one was interacting with each other. And this is a city where you usually hear like 3 or 4 languages in a block, and like it just felt like, what are we doing? And I mean, I don't know. When I'm in the studio, it becomes even more and more sacred. And because of the pace of the art world and artists being considered content providers, fuck that. We are not content providers. We need to sit and eat a cheese sandwich and stare at the wall some days. And if you're lucky enough to not have 5 other jobs, eat that cheese sandwich. That's a quote.
Probably have time for one more question, even though that would have been a good closing note.
Oh, the cheese. Everyone's going to want cheese now because it is like so cold.
I do. Now I need lunch. As a musician and music lover, I'm just so interested to know how music came to inform your work and become a part of it, and if it was a decision or a revelation or something that you knew from the beginning, or just how that happened.
It was really an acknowledgement that I was spending a lot of time way pre-streaming when we had agency over what we were going to listen to, and not that I was spending a lot of time in the studio curating what I was queuing up and curating what I was going to listen to as a warm-up to make, or to end up just not making and listening. And I think that was sort of an overt bridge and the beginnings of looking at music history and art history, and looking at all the radicality that came from African-American musicians at the same time that it was separated from all of these other parts of art history, and saying like, well, art school doesn't talk about this, but this is the same year, like that kind of matching. But also I had a lot of music in my house as a kid, and we had a piano, and there was just very encouraging ears around. I quit everything. That's like my thing. That's on a t-shirt. Like I quit painting, I tried to play the violin. I tortured my own tender ear because it's a horrible thing to try to learn. And I was dyslexic, so I would just play back the piano. I would ask the teacher to play it, and then I would just play it back without reading. Because I had a really good ear, but I was like, oh, this looks like chicken scratch to me. Which then, of course, is a Cy Twombly. So, but yeah, I'm a quitter of instruments and a listener of everything. Sometimes, but sometimes it's, actually there's a lot more silence, and I used to listen to a lot more talk stuff, and I don't even do that anymore. It really is, there's a lot of need for just quiet for me right now, for most of us.
Thank you once again, Jennie and Evelyn. It's been such a
women.
pleasure and a privilege.
Amazing. Thank you guys for coming. It's so cold.